The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in April of 1863, when Bologna's university quarter still glistened with last night's rain. Giuseppe Marchetti, bent over his workbench examining the delicate skull of a hoopoe, barely noticed his assistant's entrance until the young man cleared his throat twice. The correspondence bore the elaborate seal of Villa Corvino, pressed deep into burgundy wax, the kind of ostentation that whispered of old money clinging to older traditions. Strange how life pivots on such small moments. Had Marchetti dismissed the letter? Had he been too engrossed in his cataloging? This entire tale would never have unfolded. But he set down his calipers, wiped his hands on the leather apron his late wife had given him 6 Christmases ago, and broke the seal. Baron Ettore Corvino requested the honor of his expertise. The estate, perched above Taormina on Sicily's eastern coast, harbored what local naturalists claimed were several undocumented species of songbirds. Would the esteemed ornithologist consider a commission of 6 weeks, handsomely compensated, to catalog these treasures? Spring migration season was upon them. Time was essential. Marchetti's fingers traced the letter's elegant script while his mind performed those small calculations that working men know so well. The conference in Milan he'd miss. The specimens awaiting classification balanced against 3 months' salary for 6 weeks' work. Sicily. He'd never been south of Rome. The journey consumed 8 days. First, the bone-rattling coach to Florence, where he caught the new railway line to Rome, progress incarnate, even if the locomotive's soot turned his collar black within an hour. Then came the steamer to Naples, that chaotic city where Garibaldi's red shirts had marched just 3 years prior. And finally, the packet boat to Messina. Each leg carried him deeper into an Italy he barely recognized, where the fervor of unification gave way to ancient rhythms, where his Bolognese accent marked him as forestiere, forever foreign. From Messina, a private carriage wound through mountain roads that seemed designed by goats rather than engineers. The driver, a leather-faced Sicilian who spoke in rapid dialect, gestured at every shrine and crossroads with tales Marchetti only half understood. Something about bandits, something about angels, something about a bird that sang of death. Villa Corvino revealed itself at sunset, when the light transformed everything to amber and shadow. The main house, 3 stories of faded ochre stucco, presided over terraced gardens that tumbled toward the sea. Once magnificent, now touched by that particular melancholy of noble estates caught between epochs. Weeds colonized the formal parterre. Statues stood gap-toothed where marble fingers and noses had surrendered to time. The major domo who greeted him, Carmelo Bianchi, 51 years of careful service etched into his face, led him through halls hung with portraits of Corvino ancestors. Each painted gaze seemed to judge this common-born naturalist tracking mud across their geometric tiles. "The Baron keeps country hours," Carmelo explained, his Italian precise but accented. "Dinner at 8. Your room overlooks the lemon groves." That evening, Marchetti descended to find the family assembled in a dining room that could have hosted 40 but held only 5. Baron Ettore Corvino sat at the head, a man who wore his 71 years like armor, upright, rigid, but visibly brittle beneath. His son Ruggiero lounged to his right, 45 years of dissipation barely concealed by expensive tailoring. The daughter, Lucia, occupied her father's left, her 39 years unmarried by choice or circumstance, hands folded with practiced stillness. "Professor Marchetti," the Baron's voice carried old authority, "we are honored. I trust your journey wasn't too taxing." Before Marchetti could respond, Ruggiero interjected, "Father insists on dragging scholars from the north, as if our local naturalists weren't sufficient." The words smiled while the eyes evaluated. Lucia's intervention came swift and smooth. "The Baron values expertise, brother. Besides, fresh eyes often see what familiar ones overlook." Her glance at Marchetti held neither warmth nor hostility, merely assessment. Over courses of stuffed sardines and caponata, conversation meandered through safe channels. The university's recent expansions, the weather's unseasonable warmth, the challenges of cataloging Sicily's bird life. Yet beneath this cordial surface, Marchetti sensed crosscurrents. Ruggiero's fingers drummed impatiently whenever his father spoke. Lucia watched her brother with the vigilance of someone expecting storms. The Baron himself seemed to fade between courses, as if each exertion cost him dear. Only when the servants cleared the dessert plates did the Baron lean forward. "Professor, there's something you should know. Our family has a peculiarity. In our gardens lives a bird, l'uccello piangente, the morning bird. Its cry, they say, foretells a Corvino death." Ruggiero's snort earned him his father's glare. "Superstitious nonsense, father. You're frightening our guest with fairy tales." "7 times in 3 centuries, the Baron continued, ignoring his son. "7 times the bird is sung, and 7 Corvino men have died within the month. My grandfather heard it in 1812, my uncle in 1835. Marchetti chose his words carefully. "Nature often inspires folklore, Baron. Perhaps my work here might shed scientific light on your family legend." 5 days passed in the rhythms of observation. Marchetti rose before dawn when the garden stirred with authentic birdsong, finches arguing over territory, warblers announcing the day, the occasional hoopoo's soft hoop, hoop, hoop. He filled 3 notebooks with meticulous entries, sketched wing patterns, recorded call variations. The work satisfied him the way precise tasks always did, each small discovery adding to humanity's great catalog of knowledge. The household, meanwhile, moved in its own orbits. Baron Corvino spent mornings in his study, reviewing accounts with the grim determination of someone refusing to acknowledge defeat. Lucia supervised the servants with quiet efficiency, her presence felt rather than seen. Ruggiero disappeared for hours, returning with the smell of tobacco and wine clinging to his clothes, offering no explanation for his absences. On the evening of April 20th, everything changed. They had gathered for the rosary, a nightly ritual the Baron insisted upon, despite his children's visible reluctance. The small chapel, tucked into the villa's east wing, smelled of beeswax and old incense. Marchetti attended out of courtesy, standing slightly apart while the family knelt on worn velvet cushions. Don Benedetto, the local priest, led them through the mysteries in a voice worn smooth by decades of repetition. The sound began as the church bells struck 9, a low, mournful trill that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Not quite dove, not quite owl, it possessed a quality that made Marchetti's trained ear immediately alert. The cry built in intensity. 3 long notes followed by a descending cascade that indeed sounded like weeping, like grief given voice. Baron Corvino went rigid, his face, already pale in the candlelight, drained to the color of old parchment. "No," he whispered, then louder, "Not yet, not—" His hand clutched at his chest, the rosary beads scattered across marble as he toppled sideways. Lucia reached him first, cradling his head while Ruggiero stood frozen, his expression unreadable in the dancing shadows. Don Benedetto began last rites, even as Lucia commanded a servant to fetch Dr. Ferrara. The crying continued outside, 3 more cycles of that haunting melody before silence reclaimed the night. Marchetti found himself helping carry the Baron to his chambers, surprised by how light the old man felt, as if his bones were already hollowing for flight. The household erupted in controlled chaos, servants crossing themselves, whispering of the curse, while Carmelo barked orders to maintain some semblance of order. Dr. Angelo Ferrara arrived within the hour, his medical bag and modern manner cutting through the hysteria like a scalpel through flesh. A Neapolitan by training, he examined the Baron with systematic precision while the family waited in the adjoining sitting room. "His heart," Ferrara announced, emerging with his shirt sleeves still rolled. "An episode of angina pectoris, aggravated by sudden emotional distress. He's stable now, but fragile. Complete rest is essential." Ruggiero's question came too quickly. "How long does he have?" The doctor's eyes narrowed slightly. "That depends entirely on avoiding further shocks to his system. With care, months, perhaps years. Without it," he shrugged in that eloquent way Italians perfect. Later, Marchetti stood in the garden where the cry had originated, or seemed to. The quarter moon offered just enough light to navigate the paths between lemon trees. He employed a technique learned from his clockmaker father, cupping his ears to create directional receivers, turning slowly to map the acoustic landscape. Sound behaved strangely here. The villa's walls created echo chambers. The terraces bent and reflected noise in unexpected ways. Young Salvatore found him there, materializing from shadows with the silent grace servants cultivate. 26 years old, with the sharp features common to mountain villages, he carried a lamp and an expression of genuine curiosity. "You don't believe in the curse, Professore?" Marchetti considered the young man carefully. "I believe in observation and evidence. Tell me, have you heard this bird before tonight?" "Never, signore, but my grandmother, she knew the stories." "The morning bird comes when it chooses, not when we expect." Something in Salvatore's tone, a note of rehearsal perhaps, made Marchetti file this conversation for later consideration. They stood together in the lemon-scented darkness, listening to the garden's authentic nightlife, actual owls, real crickets, the whisper of wind through leaves. Inside the villa, other dramas unfolded. Through an open window, Marchetti heard Lucia's voice, sharp with accusation. "You couldn't even pretend concern, could you?" Ruggiero's response carried the lazy confidence of someone holding good cards. "Sister dear, we both know Father's heart has been failing for months. Bird or no bird, his time is limited." "And how convenient for you, with your debts in Palermo coming due." "Careful, Lucia. Spinsters who've spent their lives nursing others shouldn't throw stones. At least I tried to make something of myself beyond these walls." The argument continued, but Marchetti moved away, uncomfortable with inadvertent eavesdropping. He returned to his room to update his journal, adding not just biological observations, but questions that had nothing to do with ornithology. Why had the Baron truly summoned him? What role was he meant to play in this family drama? And most pressingly, what had made that sound? The cry had possessed certain qualities inconsistent with any bird in his mental catalog. The volume suggested a larger creature than the garden likely supported. The tonal purity spoke of a single source rather than the harmonics birds naturally produce. Most tellingly, the pattern, those 3 long notes followed by the cascade, had been too perfect, too consistent, like a song learned rather than instinctively known. Morning brought unexpected treasure. Marchetti, working his way through the estate's eastern boundary, where cultivated gardens gave way to wild machia, spotted a flash of yellow-green among the cork oaks. His pulse quickened. The movement pattern suggested something remarkable. 20 minutes of patient stalking confirmed his hope. A melodious warbler, but with markings he'd never seen. The bird's usual olive tones carried undertones of gold, its eye stripe more pronounced, its song containing extra notes that transformed the species' typical phrase. A discovery like this could make a naturalist's reputation. Marchetti spent 3 hours documenting every detail, his excitement pure and uncomplicated. Here was honest work, real science, the reason he'd devoted his life to understanding the natural world. No family dramas, no mysterious cries, just a bird being itself in its chosen habitat. The estate workers watched him with bemused interest as he returned for lunch, his jacket dusty, his notebooks clutched like treasure. An old gardener named Paolo, 70 if he was a day, approached while Marchetti cleaned his field glasses. "You look happy, Professore. Found something good?" "Indeed, Paolo. A variant warbler that might be endemic to this region." Paolo's weathered face creased into a knowing smile. "The golden one. Yes, they've been here since my grandfather's time. We call them cantatrici, the singers. But Professore, if you want to hear about birds, you should know about the other times." "Other times?" "When the morning bird sang before. My father worked here during the 1835 incident. Count Roberto, the Baron's uncle, strong as an ox, that one. Until the bird cried. Dead in 3 weeks. And before that, in 1812, Paolo glanced around, lowered his voice. That was the Baron's grandfather. They say he tried to hunt the bird, set dozens of traps, found nothing. The bird sang anyway. He died, cursing at shadows. These stories accumulated as Marchetti moved through the estate. Each servant, each field worker had their variation, their remembered detail. The cry always came at night, always during family gatherings, always when the victim was already weakened by age or illness. A pattern emerged, though perhaps not the supernatural one the tellers intended. That evening, Don Benedetto invited Marchetti to examine the parish records. The priest's study, attached to the small church serving the estate and surrounding farms, overflowed with documents dating back centuries. Leather-bound registers recorded births, deaths, marriages, all the human milestones that marked time's passage. "You're skeptical of our morning bird," Don Benedetto observed, pouring amber wine from a dusty bottle. "That's natural for a man of science. Yet consider, 7 deaths, 7 cries, across 300 years. What are the odds?" Marchetti accepted the wine, noting its excellence. These rural priests often had the best cellars. "With respect, Don Benedetto, humans excel at finding patterns where none exist. We see faces in clouds, hear voices in wind. Perhaps. But I've been priest here for 28 years. I've buried many Corvinos, women who died in childbirth, children taken by fever, men killed in feuds or accidents. The bird never sang for them, only for the direct male line, only for those who would inherit. This detail sparked Marchetti's interest. Inheritance meant money, property, power, all very earthly motivations for very earthly crimes. He asked to see the specific records. Don Benedetto, whether from wine or loneliness, proved eager to share. Together they traced the genealogy, noting dates, circumstances, ages at death. A second cry shattered their scholarly quiet just as the church bells struck 10. This time Marchetti was ready, already moving toward the door as that mournful trill began. He sprinted through the garden, Don Benedetto's shouts fading behind him. The sound seemed to originate from the old tower, a crumbling structure that once served as a dovecote, but now stood empty. By the time he reached it, silence had returned. The tower's door stood slightly ajar, something he'd not noticed in his previous explorations. Inside, wooden stairs spiraled upward into darkness. Marchetti climbed carefully, testing each step. The upper chamber contained only bird droppings and broken nesting boxes, but the window offered a perfect view of the villa. From here, sound would carry beautifully across the garden. Back at the villa, he found fresh chaos. The Baron had suffered another episode, weaker but still dangerous. Dr. Ferrara worked over him while the family gathered in the hallway. Lucia's face showed genuine distress, but Ruggiero seemed almost impatient, checking his pocket watch repeatedly. "Twice now," the Baron gasped when Marchetti visited him later. "The bird sings for me. My time grows short." "Baron, what if I told you there might be another explanation?" The old man's eyes, clouded with laudanum for the pain, struggled to focus. "You've found something?" "Questions, more than answers, but I intend to pursue them." "Good, good." The Baron's hand, thin as parchment, gripped Marchetti's with surprising strength. "I'm not afraid of death, Professor, but I won't be driven to it by tricks. If someone wishes me dead, let them at least have the courage to face me." That night, Marchetti couldn't sleep. He stood at his window, watching clouds chase across the moon, thinking about inheritance and patterns, about birds that sang on cue and towers with convenient acoustics. Below in the garden, a figure moved among the lemon trees, Salvatore, carrying something that glinted in the moonlight. The young man paused, seemed to look directly up at Marchetti's window, then melted back into shadows. The mysteries were multiplying, but then again, they always did before they resolved into truth. His father had taught him that about broken clocks. The more complicated they seemed, the simpler the actual problem usually was. Find the broken spring, the misaligned gear, and everything else fell into place. Marchetti's decision to conduct systematic nighttime observations came after discovering the old gamekeeper's journals in a dusty storage room beneath the main stairs. The volumes, their leather bindings cracked with age, contained 60 years of estate records. But the entries from 1835 proved most illuminating. Antonio Vella, gamekeeper during the last manifestation of the morning bird, had documented his own investigation with surprising thoroughness. "The sound moves," Vella had written in his crabbed hand, "never twice from the same position. Tonight from the old tower, tomorrow from the olive grove, then the chapel roof." As if the creature understands it is being pursued. The man had drawn crude maps, marking each location where he'd heard the cry. Marchetti transcribed these positions onto his own charts, noting how they formed a rough arc around the villa, all within perfect acoustic range of the family's quarters. Preparation required both discretion and assistance. He couldn't announce suspicions without evidence, yet working alone would limit his coverage of the grounds. Young Salvatore volunteered with notable enthusiasm, offering to gather lanterns and suggesting optimal observation points before Marchetti had even outlined his plans. "You seem well versed in nighttime activities," Marchetti observed, watching the footman arrange dark clothing and covered lamps with practiced efficiency. Salvatore's hands never hesitated. "Mountain villages teach such skills early, Professore. We hunted rabbits by moonlight, gathered mushrooms before dawn." Darkness becomes friendly when you understand its rules. Truth rang in those words, yet something else lingered beneath, a rehearsed quality that made Marchetti wonder what other nocturnal skills the young man possessed. Still, he accepted the help. One learned more by keeping potential adversaries close, another lesson from his clockmaker father about understanding mechanisms. That evening, while the household attended to the Baron, who remained stable but weakened, Carmelo approached with an unexpected proposal. The estate manager's 51 years of life had taught him to read situations like farmers read weather, and something in the current atmosphere clearly troubled him. "Professore, I know every stone and tree of this property. If you're planning what I think you're planning, you'll need that knowledge." "And what do you think I'm planning?" "To catch a ghost, or prove there isn't one." Carmelo's weathered face revealed nothing beyond professional concern.
"The Baron deserves truth, whatever form it takes. I've served this family too long to watch it destroy itself over superstition." They established 3 observation posts: Marchetti near the tower, Salvatore in the lemon grove, and Carmelo by the chapel. Each position commanded views of multiple approaches and potential sound sources. They would maintain watch from 9 o'clock, when the previous cries had begun, until 2 in the morning. The first night yielded only authentic nocturnal sounds. Marchetti cataloged 2 species of owl, numerous bats, and the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush. His notebooks filled with observations about wind patterns, how sound traveled differently as temperature dropped, the way the villa's architecture created natural amplification chambers. Scientific data accumulated, but no morning cry disturbed the peace. The second night brought fog from the sea, thick as wool, muffling even ordinary sounds. Salvatore appeared and disappeared in the mists like a specter himself, checking positions, maintaining lanterns. Once, Marchetti thought he glimpsed another figure near the garden wall, but the fog swallowed details before he could be certain. On the third night, April 25th, everything changed. The cry began at 10:43, later than previous occurrences. Marchetti had been documenting the hunting patterns of a barn owl when that familiar trill pierced the air. This time, his position proved optimal. The sound originated from somewhere between his post and the chapel, exactly where the acoustic patterns would be strongest. He moved swiftly but silently, employing techniques learned during years of stalking rare birds. The cry continued, 3 long notes, then the cascading descent that indeed resembled weeping. But now, closer than ever before, his trained ear detected something crucial, a faint mechanical click before each sequence began, like a valve opening or a spring releasing. A figure stood silhouetted against the chapel wall, holding something to their lips. Marchetti crept closer, using ornamental shrubs for cover. The person, too distant to identify clearly, operated what appeared to be a sophisticated bird caller, multiple chambers that could produce complex sounds. The kind of device Marchetti had seen in Parisian shops, used by hunters to lure specific game. Before he could approach further, shouts erupted from the villa. The figure, startled, dropped something that clinked against stone and fled into the maze of garden paths. Marchetti gave chase but lost them in the darkness. He returned to search for the dropped object, finding only a small metal reed, the kind used in organ pipes or music boxes. At the villa, chaos reigned. The Baron had collapsed again, this time falling down 3 stairs before Lucia caught him. Dr. Ferrara worked frantically, while Ruggiero paced the hallway, his agitation seeming genuine for once. 3 times, the Baron whispered when Marchetti visited his bedside later. The bird sings my death. Perhaps I should accept fate. Not fate, Marchetti replied carefully, but someone wishes you to believe so. The old man's eyes, clouded with pain and medication, struggled to focus. You found something? Questions crystallizing into answers. Give me time, Baron. The truth approaches. That night, alone in his room, Marchetti examined the metal reed under lamplight. Quality craftsmanship, possibly German or Swiss manufacture, not something readily available in rural Sicily. Someone had gone to considerable effort and expense to acquire the proper tools for this deception. Through his window, the garden lay silver under moonlight. Somewhere among those paths and shadows, a very human conspirator nursed their own plans. But Marchetti had learned patience from years of waiting for rare birds to reveal themselves. The hunter who moved too soon caught nothing but air. The estate's library occupied the villa's north wing, a cavern of knowledge largely forgotten by the current generation. Dust motes danced in morning light that filtered through tall windows as Marchetti pulled volume after volume from shelves that hadn't been disturbed in years. If the morning bird was indeed a family tradition of murder, rather than supernatural phenomenon, evidence would exist in these chronicles. Lucia found him there after noon, surrounded by open ledgers and correspondence. She moved with her characteristic quiet efficiency, setting down a tray of coffee and bread without disturbing his careful arrangement of documents. "You're pursuing something specific," she observed, not quite a question. Historical patterns often illuminate present mysteries. Marchetti showed her a genealogical chart he'd constructed. Every victim of the morning bird held or was about to inherit the baronial title. More interesting, each death occurred during a period of financial crisis for the estate. Lucia's fingers traced the dates. 1768, the earthquake destroyed the eastern vineyards. 1794, the failed grain harvest. 1812, the Napoleonic taxes. 1835, she paused, the sulfur mine investment that bankrupted 2 families. And now, her laugh held no humor, now we have Ruggiero's debts. Gambling in Palermo, failed shipping ventures in Messina. Father doesn't know the full extent, but I manage the household accounts. We're perhaps 3 months from insolvency. This confirmation of what Marchetti had suspected sharpened his focus. Who would benefit from your father's immediate death? Beyond the obvious? Lucia moved to the window, gazing out at gardens she'd tended for 20 years. Ruggiero inherits everything, of course. Italian law is clear about male primogeniture. But there are others, creditors who might prefer negotiating with a son rather than a stubborn old baron.
The sulfur companies seeking mineral rights father refuses to sell. And you? I receive a modest dowry, long ago set aside, enough to live quietly somewhere, perhaps open a small school. Her voice carried resignation worn smooth by years of acceptance. Unless I finally marry, of course. At 39, not much likelihood of that. Yet Marchetti had observed how Carmelo watched her during meals, the careful distance he maintained that spoke of feelings forcibly suppressed. Old stories there, certainly, but not his to pursue. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor.
A merchant from Taormina arrived seeking Ruggiero, who had vanished on one of his unexplained excursions. The man's nervous energy and persistent questions about the Baron's health suggested more than commercial interest. After he left, rebuffed by Lucia's cool courtesy, Marchetti noticed Salvatore emerging from the servants' corridor where he'd obviously been eavesdropping. "That man troubles you," Marchetti observed. Salvatore's usual composure cracked slightly. "Giuseppe Torrento. He owns half the gambling houses in Palermo. They say he collects debts in blood when money fails." "And Count Ruggiero owes him?" 15,000 lire, perhaps more." The young footman glanced around, then added quietly, "I have friends in the city. They write sometimes. The Count has until summer's end to pay." Interesting that a footman could read and had connections in Palermo's underworld. Marchetti filed this information alongside his growing understanding of Salvatore's complex position in the household. The young man clearly played multiple roles, but for which master? Evening brought Ruggiero's return in a state of barely controlled agitation. At dinner, he drank heavily, his responses to his father's questions growing increasingly sharp. When the Baron mentioned reviewing the estate's finances tomorrow, Ruggiero's knuckles whitened around his wineglass. "More scrutiny of my spending, father. Perhaps you should examine why the estate produces so little income instead." The Baron's voice remained steady despite his weakness. "The land provides what it always has, enough for those who respect it. Respect doesn't pay debts or maintain our position. The Benedetti family extracts 3 times our income from half our acreage. They modernize while we cling to tradition. The Benedettis poison their land with sulfur extraction." "I won't have it." "Then you condemn us to genteel poverty. How noble." The argument might have escalated, but Lucia intervened with practiced skill, redirecting conversation to safer topics. Still, the tension remained, thick as the volcanic soil that enriched and cursed Sicily in equal measure. Later, Marchetti walked the gardens, thinking about patterns within patterns. The morning bird appeared when financial pressure peaked and succession loomed. Each time the elder died, the younger inherited, debts were resolved through selling land or rights. A cynical cycle that had repeated for 3 centuries. But this time felt different. The Baron, though weakened, possessed strength of will. Ruggiero's desperation seemed more acute than mere impatience. And there were other players, Lucia with her hidden steel, Carmelo with his conflicted loyalties, Salvatore with his secrets, even Dr. Ferrara, who'd mentioned the Baron's heart condition was serious, but not immediately fatal without additional stress. Near midnight, Marchetti discovered something significant in the gamekeeper's journals. Antonio Vella's final entry, dated 3 days before his master's death in 1835, found marks on the tower wall. Someone climbs there regularly. Set trap with flower dust to catch footprints. Tomorrow will reveal all. There was no tomorrow for Vella.
The next page noted in different handwriting, Antonio Vella found dead beneath tower, apparent fall, neck broken. Very tragic. Marchetti stood very still, absorbing this information. Not just murder by suggestion then, but murder to cover murder. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined. He thought of the figure he'd chased, the dropped reed, his own investigations becoming increasingly visible. Perhaps it was time to be less trusting, more cautious.
His father had been right about complicated mechanisms. Sometimes they contained hidden springs designed to snap back on unwary fingers. Marchetti's clockmaker father had possessed gentle hands and infinite patience, qualities that served equally well for repairing timepieces and teaching boys about the world's hidden mechanisms.
"Sound is just vibration, Giuseppe," he'd explained once, letting young Marchetti feel the tremor of a tuning fork against his skull. "Control the vibration. Control what people hear." Now, 30 years later, those lessons proved invaluable. Marchetti spent the morning of April 28th conducting acoustic experiments throughout the villa grounds. Using a pitch pipe borrowed from Don Benedetto's church, he mapped how sound traveled across the estate, noting where echoes doubled back, where walls created amplification, where the unique topography bent and channeled noise in unexpected ways. The old tower proved particularly interesting.
Its circular stone interior created a natural resonance chamber. A whisper at the base could be heard clearly at the top, while sounds from the upper window carried across the entire garden with remarkable clarity. More telling were the fresh scratches on the stone stairs, the kind boots might make during repeated climbs in darkness. Carmelo found him there, measuring distances with a surveyor's chain he'd discovered in the estate office. The manager watched silently before speaking. "You're building a case, Professore, like a magistrate. I'm pursuing truth through observation, science, not law. In Sicily, they often amount to the same thing. Truth here has consequences." Carmelo helped hold the chain taut. "Last night, I saw someone in Ruggiero's study. Not the Count, he was in Taormina. Someone searching his papers. Did you recognize them? Dark clothing, moved like they knew the house. Could have been anyone familiar with the villa." He paused significantly. "Even young Salvatore, though I'm not accusing." That afternoon, Marchetti applied another principle from his father's workshop: reverse engineering. If someone had created an artificial bird cry, they'd need specific tools. The metal reed he'd found suggested a sophisticated device, likely European manufacture. Such items left trails, purchase records, shipping manifests, customs documents. He wrote careful letters to colleagues in Rome and Naples, inquiring about scientific instrument dealers who might have sold advanced bird callers to Sicily. The responses would take weeks, but establishing provenance mattered for building irrefutable proof. Meanwhile, he experimented with creating his own version using materials at hand. A hollow reed from the pond's edge, leather from an old bellows in the stable, metal strips from a broken music box in the villa's nursery. Within hours, he'd constructed a crude but functional caller that could approximate the morning cry's basic pattern. Dr. Ferrara arrived for his daily visit to the Baron and found Marchetti testing his creation. The physician listened with professional interest. Remarkable. Without the emotional context, it sounds almost comical, just noise through tubes. Yet at night, with fear already present, the power of suggestion, amplified by acoustic manipulation. Marchetti adjusted the reed's position. "Tell me, Doctor, how precisely can you predict the Baron's episodes?" Ferrara considered carefully. "Emotional shock triggers them most reliably, but there's a pattern. They're worst when his blood pressure is already elevated. Evening meals, family arguments, any significant stress creates vulnerability. So someone familiar with his condition could time their intervention? Theoretically, though that would require medical knowledge and cruel calculation." The doctor's expression darkened. "You're suggesting someone deliberately. I'm observing patterns. Nothing more yet." That evening proved Marchetti's acoustic theories correct in the worst possible way. The cry came at 9:37, just as the family finished another tense dinner. But this time, Marchetti was ready with his own equipment. He'd positioned himself at a calculated intersection point where sound waves from 3 possible sources would converge. The morning trill began from the tower, exactly as predicted. But now Marchetti heard what he'd been listening for, that telltale mechanical click, the slight wheeze of air through artificial chambers. More importantly, he triangulated the precise origin using techniques borrowed from his study of bird territories. He climbed swiftly but silently, avoiding the scratched steps that might creak. The tower's upper chamber was empty, but the window stood open. On the sill, drops of fresh oil gleamed, the kind used to maintain mechanical devices. Below, a figure moved through the lemon grove, heading toward the servants' entrance. Marchetti descended and circled around, intercepting the figure near the old well. Salvatore froze, his dark clothing and the wooden case he carried telling their own story. "Professore, I can explain." "Not here." The Baron collapsed again. "They're tending him." The young man's composure cracked entirely. "I never meant for it to go this far." They retreated to Marchetti's room, where Salvatore opened the case with trembling hands. Inside lay an expensive bird collar of German manufacture, multiple chambers allowing for complex sound production. The kind hunting nobility used, costing more than a servant might earn in 2 years. "Where did you get this?" "Count Ruggiero provided it. Said it was for scaring crows from the vineyard." Salvatore's laugh held bitterness. "I knew better. But he offered 50 lire. Do you understand what that means to someone like me?" "A chance to leave service, start a shop in Palermo. And your conscience?" "My conscience doesn't feed my sisters or pay for my mother's medicine." Yet shame colored his features. "The first time, the Count said it was just to frighten his father into updating his will. The second time, to encourage him to sell the mineral rights. But now you realize you're party to murder." Salvatore's silence served as confession. Marchetti studied the young man, ambitious, talented, trapped between poverty and morality, like so many in this new Italy. The kind his late wife would have called more foolish than evil, deserving redemption if possible. "Help me end this, and I'll speak for you to the authorities." "The Count will destroy me, or Torrento will, to reach him." "They'll destroy you anyway once you're no longer useful. Men who orchestrate patricide don't leave witnesses." Marchetti let that truth settle. "But if you help me protect the Baron, demonstrate remorse, perhaps there's another path forward." The fourth cry came 2 nights later, but this time Marchetti was hunting the hunter. He'd convinced Salvatore to maintain his role, to avoid arousing Ruggiero's suspicion while they gathered final evidence. The young footman had revealed the schedule,
The Count wanted one more manifestation, something definitive that would break his father's remaining will. Marchetti positioned himself differently this night, concealed among the cypress trees that lined the chapel approach. From here he could observe both the tower and the garden paths that connected the villa's various wings. Carmelo waited near the stables with two trusted groundskeepers, ready to respond to Marchetti's signal. At 10:15, a figure emerged from the villa's east entrance, not Salvatore, who remained visibly in the servants' hall, but someone in similar dark clothing.
The impersonation might have worked from a distance, but Marchetti noted the different gait, the broader shoulders, the way this person moved with aristocratic assumption rather than servant's caution. Ruggiero himself, then. Taking no chances with delegation on this crucial night, the Count climbed the tower with practiced ease, confirming he'd done this before. Perhaps he'd even been the figure Marchetti glimpsed that first night, checking his protégé's work. The mechanical bird caller appeared, its German precision gleaming in moonlight. Ruggiero began the morning cry, those 3 long notes cascading into fabricated grief. But something went wrong. The device sputtered, producing a strangled squawk instead of the pure trill. Ruggiero shook it, tried again. Another failure. In frustration, he began descending, likely planning to retrieve Salvatore's backup instrument. Marchetti moved to intercept, but the Count chose an unexpected route through the olive grove. They played cat and mouse among ancient trees, Ruggiero gradually realizing he was being herded away from the villa. Near the boundary wall, he turned to confront his pursuer. "Professor Marchetti, I should have known Father's pet scholar would interfere. Count Ruggiero, I should have known a son's greed would overcome filial duty." Even in darkness, Ruggiero's smile held poison. Filial duty? To a man who'd rather watch his legacy crumble than adapt to modern times? Who hoards land while his heir faces ruin? So you decided to hasten his departure. I decided to use local superstition to encourage an overdue transition. The Count pulled something from his pocket, not a weapon, but a leather purse, heavy with coin. 100 lira to forget tonight happened. 200 to leave tomorrow with a story about urgent business in Bologna. Your father was right about one thing: you truly don't understand the land or its people. Ruggiero's composure cracked. Spare me your northern moralizing. You don't know what it's like, watching everything decay while solutions exist. The sulfurites alone would clear my debts and fund improvements for decades. And poison the groundwater, sicken the workers, transform paradise into profit. Paradise? Ruggiero laughed bitterly. You've been here 3 weeks and think you understand Sicily? This island devours its children, Professor. The only choice is whether to die poor or rich. Their confrontation might have escalated, but shouts erupted from the villa. Not distress, celebration. Ruggiero paled, turned, and ran toward the lights now blazing from every window. Marchetti followed, finding the household gathered in the main hall where Baron Corvino stood, supported by Lucia and Dr. Ferrara, but undeniably vertical and alert. My son, the Baron's voice carried surprising strength. How fortuitous. We can finish our work, here for the announcement. Father, you should be resting. I've rested enough. Dr. Ferrara has explained everything. The stress of believing in that damned bird nearly killed me, but knowing it's false has given me new strength. The old man's gaze fixed on Ruggiero with terrible clarity. Knowing my son tried to frighten me to death has cured me of softer feelings, too.
Lucia stepped forward, holding documents. Father asked me to retrieve these from his study. Legal papers prepared months ago but never signed. Until now. Ruggiero snatched one page, read, and went white. You can't disinherit me. Italian law permits a father to bypass an unworthy heir in favor of other family. Lucia will inherit the estate. You'll receive the same dowry she would have, enough to live modestly if you're prudent. This is that northern professor's doing. He's poisoned you against me. No, my son. You poisoned yourself with greed. The Baron sagged slightly, but his voice remained firm. Salvatore confessed everything an hour ago. The bird collar, the payments, your debts to Torrento. Did you really think servants wouldn't eventually choose loyalty over coin? Marchetti glanced at Salvatore, standing among the household staff. The young man's face showed relief mixed with fear, but also something like pride. He'd chosen correctly in the end. Ruggiero's rage built toward explosion, but Carmelo and the groundskeepers moved closer, their message clear. The Count looked around the hall, at his father's disappointment, his sister's quiet triumph, the servant's judgment, Marchetti's careful observation. Then he laughed, sharp and bitter as volcanic glass. You've won this round, but debts don't vanish with disinheritance. Torrento will come for his money, and when he does, this precious estate will burn. He straightened his coat with pathetic dignity. I'll collect my things. They're already packed, Lucia informed him coolly. The carriage waits to take you to Messina. Tonight. The Count's departure unfolded with the anticlimax common to exposed schemes. No dramatic final words or gestures, just a man diminished by his own choices, walking toward exile. Marchetti watched from the window as the carriage disappeared into darkness, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret, merely the completion of an unpleasant necessity. Behind him, the Baron spoke quietly. Professor, I owe you more than payment can address. You owe me nothing beyond my agreed fee. I came to study birds and found myself studying humanity instead, both educational in their way. Will you stay, complete your original commission? Marchetti considered. The estate still held ornithological treasures, that variant warbler among them, and perhaps these people, wounded but healing, deserved continuity as they rebuilt. A few more weeks, yes, there's still work to finish. The morning after Ruggiero's departure brought unexpected revelations. Marchetti had been cataloging eggs from a rare pigeon species when Salvatore approached, no longer wearing his footman's livery, but simple work clothes that somehow suited him better. Professore, there's something else you should know about the Count's activities. They walked toward the estate's eastern boundary, where the managed groves gave way to rougher terrain. The smell hit them first, sulfur, sharp and unmistakable, carried on the morning breeze. Following Salvatore through a concealed path, Marchetti discovered what Ruggiero had hidden. An illegal extraction operation, crude but functional, bleeding yellow poison from the earth. He started this 2 months ago, Salvatore explained. Hired workers from the mainland who wouldn't talk locally. The profits went straight to his creditors, buying time. Marchetti examined the setup with growing anger. Trenches scarred the hillside. Dead vegetation marked where runoff had contaminated the soil. A stream that fed the estate's irrigation system ran cloudy with sulfur residue.
This explained the dying fruit trees he'd noticed, the unusual bird migration patterns, the very environmental mystery that had puzzled him since arrival. The Baron must see this immediately. They found the old man in his study with Lucia and Carmelo, reviewing decades of financial records. His recovery, while remarkable, remained fragile. Dr. Ferrara insisted on limited exertion. But when Marchetti described the sulfur operation, color flooded the Baron's face. That explains the Eastern Grove's decline. I blamed disease, never imagining. He stood shakily. I must witness this myself. The journey took them in the estate's old carriage, Dr. Ferrara accompanying despite his protests about appropriate convalescent activity. What they found exceeded even Marchetti's grave description. The extraction had spread like infection, following mineral veins deeper into estate property. 3 years, Carmelo estimated, examining the damage. 3 years minimum to restore the soil, assuming we stop this now. Stop it? We'll obliterate it, the Baron's voice shook with fury. Lucia, send for the authorities. This violates both regional law and basic human decency. But Lucia had wandered toward a makeshift shelter where documents lay scattered. She returned carrying ledgers, her expression grim. Father, these show more than illegal mining. Ruggiero was selling future rights, promises to expand the operation tenfold once he inherited. To whom? The Torrento family. Not just Giuseppe the gambler, but his brothers who control mining interests throughout western Sicily. She showed him contracts signed and witnessed. They believed they were buying the entire eastern portion of the estate. The implications settled over them like volcanic ash. Ruggiero hadn't just attempted patricide and environmental destruction. He'd entangled the estate in potentially ruinous legal obligations. The Baron aged visibly as he processed this betrayal's full scope. We'll fight it, Lucia declared with steel Marchetti hadn't heard before. These contracts were signed under false pretenses. Ruggiero never had authority to sell what wasn't his. Fighting the Torrentos requires more than legal arguments, Carmelo warned. They have judges in their pockets, politicians in their debt. Then we need leverage of our own. Marchetti had been studying the documents. These contracts mention government permits that don't exist, bribes to officials named specifically. The Torrentos might own local justice, but Rome's new government seeks examples of corruption to prosecute, anti-Bourbon sympathizers especially. That afternoon transformed into strategic planning. Letters were drafted to authorities in Rome and Naples, carefully documenting the illegal operation with Marchetti's scientific observations lending credibility. Don Benedetto proved surprisingly helpful, offering church connections that transcended local power structures. Salvatore's role required delicate negotiation. Technically guilty of participating in the morning bird deception, he'd also exposed it and revealed the larger crimes. The Baron, after long consideration, decided on mercy, conditional on testimony. You were a tool, not the hand wielding it, the old man told Salvatore. But tools can choose their function. Prove your better nature now. The young man's confession, written in careful detail, outlined not just the bird caller scheme, but conversations he'd overheard about the mining operation, Ruggiero's meetings with Torrento representatives, the bribes paid to local officials. His memory for dialogue proved exceptional. Perhaps those mimicry skills served purposes beyond creating false bird calls. By evening, they'd assembled a compelling case file.
But as Marchetti organized documents in the library, he noticed something troubling in the estate's older records. Similar sulfur damage had occurred before, during the 1835 incident that killed the previous Baron. He found Lucia in the garden, supervising workers who were installing barriers to prevent further contamination spread. The sunset painted everything gold, softening the environmental devastation's harsh reality. "Your family has faced this before," he said, showing her the old reports. "Every generation, it seems, produces someone who'd sell paradise for profit." She didn't look surprised, merely tired. "My great-uncle in 1835, a cousin in 1812.
Always the same pattern: debt, desperation, environmental destruction. And the morning bird? A convenient cover each time. Creates supernatural fear to hide earthly crimes." She managed a bitter smile. "At least we've finally exposed that particular fraud." Yet even as she spoke, a dove called from the tower, a real bird this time, its natural mourning somehow more poignant than any artificial imitation. Marchetti found himself thinking about cycles, how human greed repeated across generations like bird migrations, predictable in pattern if not in specific detail. That night, he helped Salvatore pack his few possessions. The young man would testify in Rome, then accept Marchetti's offer of employment as a field assistant. His talents for observation and mimicry could serve science rather than deception. "I won't disappoint you, Professore. Disappoint yourself, and you disappoint me. Succeed for your own sake, not mine." It was advice his father might have given, practical wisdom wrapped in gruff kindness. Marchetti wondered if he was growing sentimental in middle age, or if Sicily's sun had softened his northern edges. The confrontation with the Torrento family came sooner than expected. 3 days after discovering the sulfur operation, Giuseppe Torrento himself arrived at Villa Corvino with 2 associates who looked less like businessmen than enforcers. They found the Baron in his study, flanked by Lucia and Carmelo, with Marchetti present as scientific witness. "Baron Corvino," Torrento's voice carried the smooth menace of a man accustomed to getting his way. "I've heard disturbing rumors about your son's departure. My investments require clarification." "Your investments were made with someone who had no authority to promise what he sold." The Baron's strength had returned remarkably since learning the truth about the morning bird. "Ruggiero is no longer heir, and his contracts are worthless." Torrento's smile never wavered. "Contracts signed by a count carry weight regardless of subsequent family dramas. I've spent considerable money on preliminary operations." "You've spent money on destroying my land illegally," the Baron countered. "Professor Marchetti has documented the damage extensively. His report to Rome's Environmental Committee will interest them greatly." Marchetti stepped forward with his portfolio of evidence, photographs he'd commissioned from a traveling photographer, soil samples showing contamination, dead wildlife preserved as proof of poisoning. The scientific documentation transformed accusations into facts. "Additionally," Lucia added with calm precision, "we've discovered your operations predate any agreement with my brother. You've been extracting sulfur illegally for 3 months, hoping to present it as legitimate once you controlled the land." One of Torrento's associates shifted aggressively, but Carmelo's hand moved to the pistol now openly worn at his belt. The estate's groundskeepers, loyal men who'd worked this land for generations, appeared at strategic doorways. The message was clear: intimidation wouldn't work here. Torrento studied the assembled opposition, calculating. "What do you want?"
complete cessation of operations, removal of all equipment, payment for restoration costs. The Baron's terms were non-negotiable. In exchange, we don't pursue criminal charges or send our evidence to Rome. And if I refuse, then you'll discover that the new government needs examples of old corruption to prosecute. A Bourbon sympathizer illegally mining sulfur while bribing officials? You'll be perfect for their purposes. The threat landed because it was true.
Italy's recent unification had created a government eager to demonstrate its difference from the old regimes. Trento represented everything they claimed to oppose: feudal exploitation, environmental destruction, corruption of justice. After tense negotiation lasting 2 hours, agreements were reached. Trento would withdraw all claims and pay restoration costs disguised as investment recuperation. In return, the Corvino family wouldn't pursue legal action. It wasn't justice exactly, but it was resolution. As Trento prepared to leave, he paused near Marchetti. "You're the northern professor who exposed the scheme. Clever. But cleverness makes enemies in Sicily." "So does destroying the land that feeds people," Marchetti replied evenly. "I'll take my chances with the enemies of corruption." That afternoon brought unexpected resolution to another subplot. Carmelo requested private audience with the Baron, emerging an hour later with permission to court Lucia formally. The prohibition against their match, he being a state manager, she being noble, had dissolved with her new status as heir. Love deferred for 20 years could finally bloom. Lucia's reaction mixed joy with practicality. "We're neither of us young, Carmelo. No illusions about grand romance." "No," he agreed, taking her hand with infinite gentleness. "Just two people who know each other's faults and choose companionship anyway." Watching them walk the garden together, Marchetti thought about his own wife, dead these 5 years. How she would have enjoyed this story. The false supernatural exposed, young love given second chances in middle age, justice prevailing through patience and documentation rather than violence. Dr. Ferrara arrived for his daily visit, finding the Baron in remarkably good spirits. The removal of psychological stress had improved his condition more than any medicine. "Your heart remains weak," the doctor warned, "but no longer critically so. With care, you might see several more years." Years I wouldn't have had if Professor Marchetti hadn't exposed my son's scheme. The Baron turned to Marchetti. "Which raises the question of reward. Your fee covers ornithological work, not saving my life and estate. My fee is sufficient, though I would ask one consideration. Salvatore. He needs a new beginning away from Sicily's judgments." "Already arranged. My lawyers in Rome will ensure his testimony grants him immunity. Your sponsorship as his employer adds respectability." The Baron smiled. "The boy has talents worth cultivating. Perhaps he'll become a naturalist himself someday." That evening, the household gathered for dinner with an ease absent during Ruggiero's presence. Conversations flowed naturally, punctuated by actual laughter. Don Benedetto offered a blessing that thanked God for revealing truth, however painful. Even the servants seemed lighter, moving through their duties without the constant tension of recent weeks. Later, Marchetti climbed the tower one final time. The moon was nearly full, transforming the estate into a silver etching. From this height, the sulfur damage was invisible, the land appearing whole and eternal.
An actual owl called from the olive grove, Athena noctua, the little owl, whose voice carried nothing of mourning, only the simple declaration of territory and existence. He found himself composing tomorrow's letter to his colleagues in Bologna. How to explain this adventure? The rare birds he'd documented were real enough, valuable additions to science. But the human drama, attempted patricide through manufactured superstition, environmental crimes hidden beneath family dysfunction, love rekindled in autumn years, these elements would require careful framing to maintain professional credibility. Yet what struck him most was nature's resilience. Already, new growth appeared at contamination edges. Birds returned to poisoned groves, adapting, surviving. The land would heal, as it had countless times before. Human folly was temporary, the earth's patience nearly infinite. Salvatore appeared on the tower stairs, carrying a lamp. "Professore, I wanted to thank you for believing I could be better than my worst moment. We all deserve that chance. The question is whether we take it." The young man nodded, understanding the weight of opportunity. Tomorrow they would leave for Rome, then Bologna, where Salvatore would begin learning the naturalist's trade. His gift for mimicry would help in documenting bird songs. His sharp memory would aid in field observations. From deception's tool to science's assistant. Redemption through purposeful work. 3 weeks had passed since the Taranto confrontation, and May brought its full glory to Sicily. The almond blossoms had given way to forming fruits, while wildflowers carpeted the spaces between ancient olive trees. Marchetti stood in his room at Villa Corvino, packing specimens carefully between sheets of botanical paper. Tomorrow, he would depart for Bologna, taking with him not just scientific samples, but memories that would color his remaining years. The golden warbler, he'd decided to name it Ippile Corvina in honor of the estate, had proven even more remarkable than initially thought. Its unique song patterns suggested an isolated population, possibly endemic to this particular corner of Sicily. The discovery alone justified his journey, ensuring his name would appear in ornithological texts for generations. Yet somehow, this scientific triumph felt secondary to the human drama he'd witnessed and helped resolve. A knock interrupted his packing. Lucia entered, carrying a small wooden box worn smooth by age. She'd transformed in these weeks from dutiful daughter to confident heir, assuming leadership with natural authority previously suppressed by convention. "My father wanted you to have this," she said, offering the box. "A remembrance," he called it. Inside lay an exquisite pocket watch, its gold case engraved with birds in flight. The craftsmanship rivaled anything from Marchetti's father's workshop, Swiss or possibly Parisian work from the previous century. When opened, its face showed not just hours, but moon phases, seasons, even migration periods for common birds. "I cannot accept something so valuable." "You return something more valuable to us. Our father, our land, our future." Lucia's smile carried warmth he hadn't seen before. "Besides, Carmelo tells me you're always checking the time during observations, using that battered thing from your university days." She was right about his old timepiece, held together more by habit than function. This gift was practical as well as beautiful, the kind of object that would serve daily use while reminding him of extraordinary events.
That afternoon, he made final rounds of the estate, documenting recovery progress where sulfur damage was already being addressed.
New soil had been brought from uncontaminated areas. Drainage channels redirected poisoned water away from crops. The land would need years to fully heal, but the process had begun. Near the old tower, he discovered something that made him stop in wonder. A pair of mourning doves had built their nest in the very window where Ruggiero had produced his false cries. The male called to his mate, that authentic sorrow sound that had inspired the family legend. Nature reclaiming human deception with its own truth. Salvatore found him there, watching the doves with professional interest. The young man had spent these weeks preparing for his new life, studying Marchetti's notes, learning scientific nomenclature, practicing detailed observation techniques. His transformation from servant to student showed remarkable dedication. "Professor, I've been thinking about sounds, how I spent years perfecting false ones. Would it be valuable if I could recreate exact bird calls for scientific purposes? To help verify species when visual confirmation is impossible?" "Extremely valuable. Field ornithology often relies on audio identification." Marchetti recognized the deeper question beneath. "Your past skills needn't be abandoned, merely redirected toward honest purposes." That evening brought a farewell dinner that felt more like celebration. The Baron presided with renewed vitality, his health stabilized enough that Dr. Ferrara spoke optimistically of years rather than months. The announcement of Lucia and Carmelo's engagement had been received with joy by the household, their autumn wedding already being planned. "Professor Marchetti," the Baron raised his glass, "you came seeking birds and found instead a nest of vipers. Yet you stayed, helped us sort predator from prey. For that, our family is forever grateful." "I found what I always find," Marchetti replied, uncomfortable with praise, that nature and human nature often mirror each other. Both can be studied, understood, sometimes even predicted. Don Benedetto, increasingly philosophical with wine, added his own observation. "The morning bird sang after all, just not as we expected. It announced the death of old deceptions, the birth of new truths." Later, alone in the garden for his final evening, Marchetti reflected on the priest's words. Every family, every place carried its myths, stories that explained the inexplicable, made random suffering feel purposeful. The Corvino legend of the morning bird had served that function for centuries, transforming natural deaths into supernatural narrative. But myths could also be weapons, as Ruggiero had proven. The same story that comforted could be twisted to terrify, used to hasten the fate it supposedly predicted. Perhaps the real curse wasn't the bird, but the willingness to believe in curses, to surrender agency to superstition. His journal entry that night attempted to capture these thoughts. May 10th, 1863. Final evening at Villa Corvino. The case of the morning bird resolves into ordinary human greed dressed in supernatural costume. Yet, questions linger about why we so readily believe in curses while dismissing blessings as coincidence. Perhaps we expect sorrow more than joy, finding it easier to accept than happiness. The golden warbler I discovered here will bear the estate's name in scientific literature. But the true discovery was human resilience, a family surviving betrayal, servants choosing conscience over profit, love patient enough to wait decades for freedom. These specimens cannot be preserved between paper sheets or cataloged in museum drawers. They live only in memory and story. fragile as birdsong, lasting as legend. Tomorrow I return to Bologna with Salvatore, who represents hope that people can change, that our worst moments need not define us. His talent for mimicry will serve science now. My task is to teach him observation's patience, documentation's precision, truth's simple power over elaborate deception. Strange to think I'll miss this place, where I was nearly accessory to murder by suggestion. But Sicily has marked me as surely as I've marked it in my notebooks. The sun here burns away pretense, leaving only essential nature, human and otherwise. Perhaps that's why the island breeds both bandits and saints, often in the same family, sometimes in the same person. The next morning came gray with mist, unusual for May but fitting for departure. The household assembled to see them off, the Baron leaning on his cane but standing proud, Lucia and Carmelo together as they should have been years ago, servants who'd become familiar faces over these weeks. As the carriage pulled away, Marchetti heard it one last time, the mourning dove's call from the tower, genuine and melancholy. But now he heard it differently, not as death's herald, but as life's continuity, each generation calling to the next, warning and promising in equal measure. Salvatore, sitting beside him, perfectly mimicked the call, then smiled at his own skill. "Should I record that in our notes, Professor?" "Everything goes in the notes," Marchetti replied, opening his new journal, the golden watch ticking steadily in his pocket. Truth, lies, and the space between, where most of life happens. The carriage wound down toward Taormina, leaving Villa Corvino to its recovery, its genuine birds, its human dramas that would continue long after the northern professor and his reformed assistant vanished into memory. Somewhere in the garden, the golden warbler sang its unique song, neither mourning nor celebrating, simply declaring its existence in a world complex beyond full understanding, beautiful beyond complete description.